Hello and welcome, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we journey once again into the softer corners of time. A time of quiet hearts, creaking floorboards, and curious traditions kept without question. Sometimes, history isn't shaped by kings or wars, but by habits. Habits so old, no one remembers how they started, only that they must be kept. So lay down, breathe slowly, and let this evening's tale drift over you like the scent of old books and lavender. This is not a ghost story, this is not a mystery, it's just a story about a chair. A chair in the corner, the comfiest chair in the inn, and why, for nearly 100 years, nobody ever sat in it. Part 1: The Inn with One Rule. The Grindlewood Inn wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest stone building with ivy curling up one side. A chimney that always smoked just a little too much. And windows that never quite closed properly in the wind. It sat at the edge of a small village that wasn't marked on most maps anymore. Travelers didn't come often, and when they didn't stay long. Inside, though, the inn was oddly comforting. Worn rugs muffled the creaks in the wooden floors. The scent of stewed apples and pipe tobacco lingered in the low beams. The fire in the hearth was always lit, and the tea was always lukewarm, but not unpleasantly so. Time moved slower here, and nobody minded much. But of all the small details that made the Grindlewood Inn what it was, there was one that stood out more than the rest. It was the chair. A large, padded chair in the far right corner of the common room, just beside the hearth. It had a high back, rounded arms, and upholstery that, while faded, was clearly once quite grand. The seat cushion was slightly indented, suggesting years of use. It was the most comfortable-looking place in the room by far. And yet, nobody ever sat in it. Locals would take the stools, the benches, even the slightly wobbly chair by the door before they'd touch the corner chair. Travelers would sometimes approach it, lured by its promise of warmth and softness, only to be gently redirected by the innkeeper. "Oh, best not that one," they'd say with a polite smile. "Plenty of room elsewhere." No one ever made a fuss. No one ever asked why, and if you asked any of the villagers about it, they'd shrug. "It's just the way it is." They'd say, "No one sits in the corner chair." It wasn't forbidden. There were no signs, no locks, no curses carved into the wood, but over the years, the custom had become unspoken law. Even the innkeeper, Mrs. Thistleby, a woman of great cheer and twice-baked pies, didn't have much of an explanation. When asked, she would simply tilt her head and say, "Oh, it's not that we can't. We just don't." Which, of course, only made it stranger. Part 2: Mrs. Thistleby's explanation. That wasn't one. It was on a particularly slow afternoon, just before the spring rains, that a young traveler named Jonathan Penley arrived at the Grindlewood Inn. He was polite, neatly dressed, and carried a satchel filled mostly with half-finished sketches and bread that had gone stale in the last village. He had no particular destination, and less particular urgency, which made him a perfect fit for the inn. Mrs. Thistleby welcomed him with the same warmth she offered every stranger: a nod, a slice of rhubarb tart, and a room key with a bit of twine tied around it. After unpacking, Jonathan wandered into the common room, rubbing the travel from his eyes and stretching the stiffness from his back. His gaze fell naturally, inevitably, to the corner, the chair. It looked like the kind of chair made for thinking, for sitting long into the night, book in lap, firelight licking at the pages. It practically begged for company. He stepped toward it, reaching for the curved wooden arm when Mrs. Thistleby's voice broke through the quiet. "Oh, no love, not that one," she called from behind the counter, her hands deep in a tin of loose leaf tea. Jonathan paused. "Oh, is someone sitting there?" No, she said cheerfully. "It's just, well, we never use that one. But it looks very comfortable." "It is, quite. But it's best left alone." He waited for more. A smirk, a wink, a whispered warning. "Maybe." But she simply turned and went back to steeping tea, humming softly to herself as if she hadn't just said something deeply peculiar. Now, Jonathan was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in curses or restless spirits. But he did believe in curiosity. And the more he looked at the chair, the more curious he became. That evening, after supper, turnip stew with a hint of something sweet. He brought it up again. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said gently, spooning custard into his mouth. "But what's the story with the chair?" Mrs. Thistleby looked up from her knitting. The story? Yes. Why doesn't anyone sit there? Did something happen? She chuckled, a soft, low sound that blended well with the creaking floor and ticking clock. Oh, nothing happened, she said. Not really. He blinked. Not really? She considered for a moment. Knitting needles clicking softly. Well, it's just always been that way. Even when I was a girl. My mum told me not to sit there. And her mum told her the same. But why? Mrs. Thistleby smiled gently. Some questions, Mr. Penley, are better left to settle like old tea. Let them sit. Let them cool. If you stir them up, they only get bitter. Jonathan sat back in his chair, unsure whether he'd been warned, dismissed, or offered very sound advice. He didn't ask again. Not that night, anyway. But the chair remained there, perfectly still in the corner, lit softly by the firelight, the cushion slightly indented, and Jonathan began to wonder if something could be so ordinary, and yet so very not. Part 3: The First Night's Dream. Jonathan didn't sleep poorly that night, but he didn't sleep well either. The bed in his small upstairs room was fine, not especially soft, not particularly lumpy. The linen smelled faintly of lavender and chimney soot. Outside, the wind rustled through the ivy and made the wooden shutters tap gently against the stone. But in his mind, the chair sat, still, waiting. It had become a quiet thought that refused to leave. And so, when sleep finally came, it did so lightly, like a thin wool blanket rather than a deep downy one. The kind that warms but never fully comforts. In his dream, Jonathan was back in the common room. The fire glowed steadily. Shadows played across the ceiling. But the room was otherwise empty. No Mrs. Thistleby. No regulars. No clock ticking. Just him. And the chair. It was no longer just worn, it was regal. The cushion fuller. The arms polished. A single shaft of warm light poured onto it from a lamp that didn't exist in waking hours. It looked inviting. Glorious. Even. The kind of chair kings might sneak away to when no one was looking. And then, very softly, the chair creaked. Not because someone sat in it, but as if it had just moved on its own. A sigh of fabric. A subtle shifting. Like it had adjusted itself slightly. Comfortably. Jonathan stepped closer. The rest of the room grew dimmer with every pace. Then he heard it. A sound not quite a whisper. Not quite a breath. Something between the rustle of old fabric and the hush of someone about to speak. He froze. And then, he woke. Not with a start. Not with sweat. But with a sense of unease, like when you leave a door open by mistake. Or when a thought escapes you. But you know it was important. The sun hadn't yet risen. A faint gray light pressed at the curtains. The room was still. His shoes were at the foot of the bed. Exactly where he'd left them. But the chair lingered in his mind like a word on the tip of his tongue. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and quietly muttered to himself. That's enough stew before bed. Downstairs, the common room waited in silence. And the chair, of course, remained in its corner. Unmoved, untouched. Just as it always had been. But Jonathan, from that morning onward, began to watch it, not suspiciously, not fearfully, but attentively. And over the coming days, he noticed things. Things no one else seemed to mention. Part 4: The Quiet Things That Weren't Quite Right. By his third day at the Grindlewood Inn, Jonathan had taken to sitting in the same spot by the fireplace, 2 chairs to the left of the corner one. It wasn't especially comfortable, but it gave him a clear view. A good observational perch. He wasn't watching for ghosts. He didn't believe in those nor for tricks or pranks. The inn was too still. The villagers too placid. What Jonathan began to notice were the small things. The things that shouldn't matter, but, when repeated daily, began to feel like part of a pattern. For instance, the dust. Mrs. Thistleby kept a clean inn. Even the mantle above the hearth was wiped every day. But the corner chair? Its arms never gathered dust. The wood always looked gently polished, even though no one touched it. The light at a certain time in the afternoon, around 4. By his watch, the sun would move just enough through the western window to catch the edge of the chair's fabric. And yet, the dust in the air around it never quite shimmered like it did elsewhere. As though the sunlight avoided falling directly upon the seat itself. The fire, it crackled and glowed evenly through the day. But Jonathan noticed the flames never threw their full warmth toward that corner. The air near the chair was temperate. Certainly, but not warm. A kind of constant, neutral zone in a room otherwise alive with heat and hearth. And then there were the villagers. They'd come and go, always friendly, always gentle in their movements. They played cards near the back table, or read dog-eared almanacs by the front window. But none of them ever looked directly at the chair. Jonathan tested this. He brought it up in casual conversation. Odd spot to leave such a lovely chair unused, don't you think? Each time, the response was the same, a smile, a shrug, a non-answer. Oh, that thing's been there forever. Don't really notice it anymore. We've got our places. I suppose. One afternoon, an old man named Corman, a retired chimney sweep, was recounting tales of the Great Ash Fall of 22. When Jonathan gently probed, "Ever wonder why nobody sat in that chair all these years?" Corman paused. His eyes didn't flick to the chair. They stayed on Jonathan. "That chair?" he said slowly. Don't much think about it. Ever seen anyone sit in it?" "No," he said, after a beat, "but I reckon I'd remember if I did." And with that, he went back to his story. As if nothing had passed between them. The room carried on, but Jonathan felt, for the first time, like he'd been handed a breadcrumb. A very dry, very vague breadcrumb. He began keeping a small journal. Not of feelings or impressions, but facts. Times, temperatures, placement of shadows, who entered the room and where they sat, when the logs were placed on the fire, whether the wind outside ever made the chair's cushions stir. And slowly, over the span of days, he began to see a shape forming. Not a sinister one, not yet, just a pattern. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled him most. Part 5. The Man with the Brown Umbrella. It rained on the 5th day. The kind of rain that doesn't so much fall as settle into the air, a misty drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and painted the village in a glossy gray sheen. The inn was busier than usual. Though busy, at the Grindlewood Inn still only meant 4 villagers and 1 traveler. The fire crackled politely. Mrs. Thistleby brewed tea with cloves. And Jonathan, now fully invested in the mystery of the chair, sat with his notebook partially hidden beneath a week-old newspaper. It was just past midday when the man with the brown umbrella arrived. No one saw him approach. One moment the door was closed, and the next, it opened with a sharp creak, ushering in a swirl of damp air and a tall man wrapped in a long, deeply creased coat. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. His face was weathered in that way where you couldn't tell if he was 40 or 60. He nodded politely, closed the umbrella with a practiced snap, and stood for a moment in the doorway as though deciding whether he'd actually stepped into the right place. Mrs. Thistleby greeted him with her usual cheer, but she didn't recognize him, and neither did anyone else in the room. Which, in a village this small, was worth noting. "A room for the night?" she asked. "Just a rest for now," he replied, in a voice with no particular accent. "Long road from Norley." Mrs. Thistleby nodded and gestured toward the tables. "Make yourself comfortable. Then, tea'll be out in a moment." And then, something happened. Something Jonathan would remember in detail. Over and over again, the man looked around the room. He scanned the tables, the bench near the hearth, the stool by the grandfather clock. And then he looked, really looked, at the corner chair. His eyes paused on it. Not brushed past it, not skipped over it like everyone else's. He saw it, and he walked toward it. Jonathan's breath caught, though he wasn't sure why. The room, quiet before, seemed to quiet further. The man reached the chair, set his folded umbrella against the wall beside it, and, without hesitation, sat down. The cushion gave the slightest sigh. And then the room changed. Not in any dramatic way. No gasps, no rattling windows. But something shifted, like a weight had moved that no one realized was there. The man leaned back, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. Jonathan looked around. Mrs. Thistleby had frozen behind the counter, teacup halfway to the tray. The villagers, Corman among them, had all gone still in the same breath. One woman clutched her knitting needles, motionless mid-loop. Nobody said anything. Then, just as quietly, the man opened his eyes again. Not startled, calm. He looked around, almost puzzled, and said, comfy. Jonathan felt a chill that didn't come from the fire. And for the first time, someone other than himself, had asked a question with their presence. A question long avoided. Why didn't anyone sit in the chair? And what happened when someone did? Part 6. The reaction nobody spoke about. The man with the brown umbrella didn't stay long. After sitting silently in the corner chair for nearly 15 minutes, sipping the tea Mrs. Thistleby finally managed to place gently on a tray beside him, he stood, stretched, and offered a polite nod to the room. "Lovely spot," he said. "Strange quiet in the walls, but quite pleasant." No one answered. He gathered his umbrella, adjusted his coat, and walked back out into the drizzle without fanfare or farewell. The bell above the door gave a dull chime as it swung shut behind him. And then, the inn breathed again. Corman let out a cough, as though he'd been holding it back. The knitting woman dropped a stitch. Mrs. Thistleby returned to polishing the barred top with a cloth that had no need for polishing. No one looked at the chair. It sat exactly as it had before, a bit of cushion pressed down, the firelight dancing lazily across its worn fabric. But something had changed. Jonathan stood slowly and walked over to where the man had sat. He didn't touch the chair, but he hovered near it. He looked for scorch marks, threads unraveling, any visible sign that something had happened. There was none. He turned to Mrs. Thistleby, who was furiously pretending to organize a stack of mugs. "Do you know who that was?" She didn't look up. Never seen him before. And he sat in the chair. Mrs. Thistleby said nothing. "Does that mean anything?" Still nothing. Jonathan was about to press further when Corman shuffled over, hands tucked in his worn waistcoat, and spoke quietly. "That chair's been empty near 100 years. Lad." Jonathan nodded. "I gathered that. No one's dared sit in it since old Ned." "That was new." "Who's old Ned?" Corman tilted his head. "Well, that depends who you ask." Jonathan waited, but the old man didn't elaborate. "What happened to him?" "He sat in the chair," Corman said simply. "And after that, he left. Quietly. Just like this one." Jonathan felt the weight of the coincidence settle onto his shoulders. "So, someone sat in it once before? And they just disappeared?" "Didn't disappear," Corman corrected. "Just didn't come back. But that could be anyone. Could just be passing through." "Could," the old man agreed. "But that's 2 in 100 years. And neither stayed more than a cup of tea." Jonathan sat down, not in the chair, of course, but in his usual one nearby. He watched the fabric of the seat across from him, still indented, still slightly warmer than the rest of the room. And then he asked the question that had been circling him since the first night. What if the chair wants to be sat in?" Corman chuckled under his breath. "A chair don't want anything." Jonathan frowned. "But what if it's not about curses? Or fears? Or stories? What if it's something simpler? Like memory?" The old man turned to him slowly. "A chair that remembers?" Jonathan shrugged. "It's been there for so long. What if it knows who belongs in it? What if it waits?" Corman looked at the chair. For the first time in days, he looked at it directly. And his voice, when he spoke, was quieter than the wind outside. "Then we best hope it forgets." Part 7. A brief history of old Ned. That evening, Jonathan did what any curious traveler would do in a quiet village with a puzzle on his hands. He asked more questions than were welcome. The regulars of the Grindlewood Inn were friendly folk, in that way where friendly often meant kind, but not especially talkative. But when he mentioned old Ned, even that veneer of openness thinned. Mrs. Thistleby gave him a tight smile and said, "Best not go digging in long-set soil." Dear Corman, slightly more forthcoming than the rest, offered him a stool near the hearth and lowered his voice just enough to make the room feel smaller. "Ned Copley," he began, tapping ash from his pipe, "was the sort of man people liked to forget while pretending they remembered." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means he was odd. Odd in the way that makes a man memorable, but not missed." According to Corman, old Ned had been the inn's handyman, fixing shutters, replacing roof tiles, hauling sacks of coal up from the cellar. He didn't own much, didn't speak often, and had the habit of staring too long at things. Especially the chair. Even back then, people didn't sit in it, Corman said. But Ned, he watched it. How long ago was this? 86 years, Corman replied instantly. Give or take a winter. Jonathan blinked. You remember it? My granddad told me the story. Told it the same way every time. Even when he forgot my name. Corman continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of something repeated too often to be fiction. One morning, Ned came down early. Mrs. Paltram, innkeeper back then, said she found him just standing there, next to the chair, said he looked different, lighter, like something had been let go. And he sat in it. Jonathan leaned forward. And nothing happened. Not at first, Corman said, eyes fixed on the fire. He sat for an hour. Just sat. Then he stood, nodded politely to the room, and walked out. He never came back? Not once. No one heard from him again? No one looked. Jonathan frowned. Why not? Corman's voice lowered further. Because everyone felt like he'd left. Not just the inn, not just the village, but further, deeper. Like the chair let him go somewhere we weren't meant to follow. Silence settled between them. The fire hissed gently. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked with the lazy complaint of age. Jonathan thought about that. About a man watching a chair for years. About choosing to sit in it when no one else would. About walking away from everything without regret. And a strange thought curled its way into his mind like steam from a forgotten kettle. What if the chair doesn't trap people? What if it frees them? He said nothing aloud. But later that night, as he passed through the common room and up toward bed, he paused beside the chair. Just for a second, close enough to feel its presence. Not warm, not cold, just still. And in that stillness, he thought he heard something. Not a voice, not a whisper, just a sound like breath exhaled softly like an old chair settling into itself. Part 8. What the chair might remember. Jonathan couldn't shake the sound. That soft, sigh-like breath the chair had made as he passed it. It was the kind of sound that furniture didn't make unless someone had just stood up from it, or was about to sit down. But no one had. The chair remained undisturbed, its cushion gently indented as always, its faded upholstery dimly lit by the dying fire. The next morning, over porridge and blackcurrant jam. He didn't ask anyone about it. He didn't need to. The silence of the inn said everything. It had weight, it had age, it had memory. And Jonathan began to wonder if the chair did, too. Not in the way that people remember, not names, or birthdays, or the way your favorite shoes felt when you were 12, but in that slow, subtle way an old path remembers being walked, the way a wall remembers the wind, the way a keyhole remembers the hand that always fumbled on the first try. That sort of memory. That day, instead of walking the muddy lanes or sketching root vegetables in the market, Jonathan stayed inside. He sat near the hearth again. He watched the chair, and he thought, if a chair could remember, what would it choose to forget? The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. Could an object grow tired of being sat on? Could it learn not to trust those who placed their weight in it? Or perhaps, it had once belonged to someone who left so strong a presence behind that the very fabric of the seat refused to be shared again. He jotted notes. The chair never creaks unless approached. No one dusts it. Yet it stays clean. Does it sense? Respond? He crossed that line out. Too fanciful. Too ridiculous. Too, possibly true. That afternoon, something odd happened. Jonathan was reading when a small boy wandered in, the grandson of one of the villagers. Perhaps, a sprightly thing, no older than 5, with muddy boots and a stick that he swung like a sword. The boy darted through the tables, making quiet, whoosh, noises as he parried invisible goblins. Then, he paused. He stood directly in front of the chair, staring at it with a puzzled frown. Jonathan looked up from his book. The boy reached out, just barely, and touched the armrest. Then he pulled his hand back sharply, as if it had stung him. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, but he backed away slowly and then ran out of the room. Dropping his stick on the rug, Jonathan rose immediately and walked over. He examined the armrest. Nothing strange, nothing hot, no splinters, no static shock, just smooth, worn wood. He turned and saw Mrs. Thistleby watching him from the hall. Not angry, not concerned, just watchful. Jonathan called out, "Did you see?" She shook her head. "Best not, dear, best not." And then she walked away. Later, Jonathan picked up the boy's stick and leaned it against the wall, near the umbrella that had never been retrieved. 2 things left behind, one by a stranger, one by a child. Both, perhaps, marking the same kind of memory. Part 9. A map with no markings. By now, Jonathan's notebook was half full. Not with sketches, though it had begun as an artist's companion, but with lines of scribbled observation. Timetables, reactions, theories, and questions. So many questions. He had become, in his own quiet way, something between a historian and a detective. But there were no crimes. No perpetrators. No one had been hurt. No one had even raised their voice. The mystery was silent, subtle, and that, somehow, made it deeper. That morning, he took tea with Mrs. Thistleby. They sat in the far nook of the dining room, just beyond view of the chair. She served him scones with black currant jam and clotted cream. And when he asked about the boy, she only smiled faintly. Children feel things, she said, long before they understand them. Jonathan sipped his tea. What do you think he felt? Mrs. Thistleby didn't answer. She poured herself a second cup. Then Jonathan tried a different question, one he hadn't dared ask before. Have you ever sat in it? That made her pause. She didn't look offended, just reflective. No, she said after a long silence. But I dusted it once. Jonathan blinked. And? She smiled, not the smile of amusement, but the sort that covers something else. It felt like I was interrupting a conversation I didn't belong in. Jonathan considered that. Do you think the chair is haunted? Mrs. Thistleby chuckled softly. No, a haunted chair would be easier to explain. He closed his notebook. Then what is it? She stirred her tea gently. A memory. Perhaps. Not of a person, but of a moment too heavy to let go. Jonathan sat with that. A memory that didn't fade. A presence that wasn't sinister. Just persistent. And then Mrs. Thistleby surprised him. She reached into a drawer nearby and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. I don't often share this, she said, but I think it's time. She handed it to him. It was a floor plan, rough, hand-drawn, stained with years. It showed the Grindlewood Inn as it stood today, but not quite. There was a room marked behind the corner chair, a space that no longer existed. No door, no mention in the current layout. What is this? Jonathan asked, tracing the lines with his finger. That, she said, was the study. He looked up. Whose? Mrs. Thistleby met his gaze. Eyes suddenly older than her face. No one knows. She stood, dusted crumbs from her apron, and returned the parchment to its drawer. I'd forgotten I had that, she said, though Jonathan suspected she hadn't. Some things get walled off. Buried. Built over. She turned to leave. But chairs, they remember. Part 10 Behind the Wall. The next morning, Jonathan woke with purpose. There was something about that old floor plan, something about the vanished room behind the chair, that had settled in his bones overnight like damp. He felt it the way one feels a missing tooth, or a tune half remembered but never quite recalled. After breakfast, buttered toast, soft eggs, no conversation. He waited until the common room was empty. Then he did what no one else had tried in decades. He pushed the chair, just a little. It glided across the floorboards more smoothly than expected, barely making a sound. The fire hissed softly in its hearth. Unconcerned. Behind the chair, wall, a simple wooden panel, the same color as the rest of the inn. But Jonathan stepped closer, ran his hand along the seams. There, faint, but present, a vertical line. A slight ridge in the wood. Not fresh, but not quite fully hidden by time either. He knocked, hollow, 3 times, and each knock gave the same echo, not the muffled thump of a solid wall, but the curious resonance of space, of something beyond. He went to fetch Mrs. Thistleby, not to ask permission, just to tell her what he'd found. She met his words with silence, then exhaled slowly, as though she had been holding the breath for years. I wondered when someone might find it, she said, not angry, not afraid. You knew? I suspected, she said. My grandmother spoke of the study, said it had been sealed off after the war, not for any sinister reason, but because the inn was too large and too drafty. Easier to wall it off than heat it. And no one's opened it since? Not that I know of. So they opened it. It took an hour, 2 flathead screwdrivers, and a bit of oil. The panel came free with a reluctant groan, like a long-closed book opening to a forgotten chapter. Behind it, dust, cold air, and darkness. Jonathan stepped inside first, holding a lantern borrowed from the cellar. The room was small, not much bigger than a pantry, but it was unmistakably a study. There was a writing desk in the far corner, long abandoned papers curled with age, a shelf with crumbling books whose titles had faded into anonymity, a single, narrow window, long boarded over from the outside, and in the center of the room, facing the hidden panel, an empty space, square, indented in the dust, as if, once upon a time, Something heavy had been placed there, something with legs, something shaped like a chair. Jonathan turned slowly, back toward the door, back toward the common room. The chair, the one they had all avoided, the one no one had ever questioned. Not properly. It hadn't always been in the corner. It had once belonged here, to this room, to this desk, to someone. And somehow, when the room was sealed, the chair remained outside, like it had been waiting to come back. Part 11. The Man Who Wrote Nothing. The study had no name carved above the door, no portrait on the wall, no diary tucked into a drawer with a clue as to who had once sat there. Day after day, year after year, Jonathan searched carefully, respectfully. Mrs. Thistleby stood at the threshold, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She did not enter, not once. She simply watched. There was a chair once, that much was certain. The marks on the floor said so. The positioning of the desk said so. The slight fade in the floorboards, darker around a lighter square. Jonathan rifled through the desk, not with the haste of excitement, but with the care of someone opening a box left behind by a stranger. Inside, there were papers, but every page was blank. Not torn, not faded, not erased, blank, clean, save for age-stained edges, as if someone had once placed them there. Day after day, waiting for inspiration to strike, he found a single fountain pen. Dry, no ink bottle. He held the pen to a sheet and pressed. The nib split slightly, brittle with time. He set it down again. Then he found the object that changed the tone of the day entirely. It was beneath a stack of papers in the bottom drawer. A small, folded envelope. No wax seal. Just a name written in slanted, deliberate script. To no one in particular. Jonathan looked up. The air in the room seemed cooler. He opened it. Inside, a single note, handwritten, still legible after all these years. Just 5 words. I sat. It remembered me. No name, no date, just that. He turned the page over. Nothing else. He read the sentence again. I sat. It remembered me. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A confession? A goodbye? He showed it to Mrs. Thistleby. She didn't read it right away. She took the envelope in her hands and stared at the writing on the front. Grandmother used to say that before she passed. She murmured. Say what? Mrs. Thistleby traced the words with her thumb. She'd sit by the fire, look at the chair, and say, it remembers more than we do. Jonathan's mind spun. The blank pages, the chair left behind, the study sealed up, as if memory itself had been boarded over. And in the middle of it all, this single line, a line not of fear, but of acknowledgement. The chair remembered him. Whoever he was, whoever they were. Not a haunting, not a curse, a presence. Part 12. The weight of presence. For the rest of that afternoon, Jonathan didn't speak much. He sat near the chair, not in it, never in it, and simply observed. The fire crackled, the tea cooled, the wind carried low sounds of village life, muffled by old glass and thicker still by thought. The study had been left as it was. Mrs. Thistleby hadn't locked it. She hadn't even closed the panel properly. But neither of them had stepped back inside since finding the note. I sat. It remembered me. The phrase had settled over the inn like dust on untouched books. As the evening wore on, a few villagers trickled in. They noticed the chair had been moved slightly. No one commented. No one asked. Corman arrived last and paused mid-step when he saw it. Something's different, he said, more to the air than to anyone. It is, Jonathan replied quietly. Corman sat, not in the corner, of course. He chose the creaky bench. Same as always. He didn't ask what had changed. And Jonathan didn't offer. Some truths required silence to stretch into. That night, after the fire had died down and the inn was tucked in shadows, Jonathan returned to the common room once more. The chair was back in its corner, facing the hearth, still slightly indented, still utterly ordinary and utterly not. Jonathan stood before it. I know you don't speak, he whispered, but I think you listen. No reply, no movement. He placed his hand gently on the armrest. It was warm, not from the fire, not from the air, warm like memory, not frightening, not alive, but present, deep, as if the wood had soaked in moments over generations, moments of silence, of grief, of joy never spoken aloud. He closed his eyes, and then, something happened. He didn't hear words, he didn't see visions, but he felt something pass through him. A feeling, Like someone had just left the room. Like a goodbye that didn't need words. Like the trace of a scent you haven't smelled in years that suddenly reminds you of someone you loved. The chair pulsed with it. Not literally, but emotionally. He pulled his hand back gently. A part of him wanted to sit. Another part, deeper, older, wiser, knew he shouldn't. Not yet. Some seats are not claimed, they're offered. He whispered again. You're waiting, aren't you? The chair, as always, didn't move, but Jonathan thought, just for a heartbeat, that the cushion sighed once more. Part 13. The night the clock stopped. It happened on a Thursday. Sometime past midnight. Jonathan was halfway through a note to himself, something about how the chair seemed to hum. Almost imperceptibly. When it rained, when he noticed it, the ticking had stopped. He looked up from his notebook. The grandfather clock in the corner, a towering, walnut-stained fixture of the Grindlewood Inn, had gone utterly still. No chime, no movement, no slow tick-tock to carry the silence. He rose, crossed the room, and checked the face. The hands were frozen at 12:17. He glanced at his wristwatch. 12:17. Exactly. Strange. The clock had never stopped before. Not in all the nights he'd spent listening to it mark the slow stretch of time. He opened the case. The pendulum was motionless. He nudged it gently. It swung, once, twice, then faltered and stilled again, as though the air itself had thickened. He turned. The chair was exactly where it had been, but something about it was different. Not visually, not physically, energetically. The room itself had changed shape in a way he couldn't explain. Not a rearrangement of objects, but of atmosphere, as though the air were holding its breath. He sat, not in the chair, never in the chair, but in his usual spot nearby. He waited, he listened, nothing, and then, a chime, not from the grandfather clock, but from the wall, the study. It was faint, muffled, distant, like a bell buried beneath wood and plaster, ringing once and then vanishing into the quiet. Jonathan stood slowly and crossed the room. The panel that led to the study creaked slightly as he pushed it open. His lantern illuminated the dust-laced space within. The desk, the empty square on the floor, the narrow, shuttered window, all untouched. But something had made that sound. He stepped inside. Nothing greeted him. No ghosts, no breeze, no message scrawled in chalk. But on the desk, where once there had only been blank pages, lay a single folded sheet. He picked it up. In the same script as before, the same hand that had written "I sat. It remembered me," were 6 new words. When time stops, memory begins again. Jonathan stood in the study for a long time. Longer than he could measure. Because the clock was no longer ticking. He finally left when the lantern burned low. And when he returned to the common room, he found that the grandfather clock had resumed its quiet rhythm, ticking gently once more, but the hands still read 12:17. Part 14. The ledger with no names. The next morning, Jonathan awoke before dawn. The room was quiet, and the clock downstairs was ticking again, but he couldn't shake the sense that something in the fabric of time had folded ever so slightly. The kind of fold that can't be seen but is felt, like the crease in a well-worn map. He dressed, took a cup of tea from the silent kitchen, and returned to the study. This time, Mrs. Thistleby didn't watch him. She didn't need to. The study felt colder than before. Not in temperature, but in tone, like it had remembered being forgotten, and wasn't sure how to feel about being rediscovered. Jonathan lit a lamp. The note from the night before, "When time stops, memory begins again," remained on the desk. He read it twice more, then turned to the shelves. Most of the books were brittle and crumbling, their titles unreadable, but one volume stood out. A leather-bound ledger. No title on the spine. Just a buckle that had long since rusted loose. He opened it. Blank page. Then another. Then another. 20 pages in, he found writing. A list. But not of names. Not of dates. Just descriptions. The woman with the bell pin and shaking hands. The boy who stared at the floor but hummed. The man who never knocked but always returned. The stranger who asked for tea, never drank, and left coins that vanished by morning. Page after page of these entries. No names, no times, no outcomes, just glimpses of people. It read like a memory that didn't need to know who or when, just what they left behind. Toward the back of the book, Jonathan found an entry that made his skin chill. The chair waits. It remembers voices, not faces. We are only echoes to it. Then, below that, one last note, different in tone, almost an afterthought. When it is finally sat in by the right person, it will stop remembering. Jonathan closed the book slowly. That line didn't feel ominous. It didn't feel hopeful either. It felt like the end of a cycle that had gone on far too long. The chair remembered because it had been left behind, but one day, someone would come who belonged to it, or it to them, and then it would rest. Jonathan looked back into the common room. The chair sat in the corner, angled slightly, as though it had turned to listen. He wondered, had others come before? Like him, had they watched, waited, and chosen not to sit? Had they made it further into this mystery, or less? He took out his notebook and wrote, "The chair is not cursed, it is not haunted, it is burdened." And as he closed his journal, he realized something else. The corner wasn't the chair's true place. It had been placed there, pushed away, hidden in plain sight. Its real place was in the study, where memories had been written without names, where time had paused, where the chair, long ago, had been a witness. Part 15: The Innkeeper's Silence. That evening, Jonathan approached Mrs. Thistleby behind the bar. The common room was nearly empty, save for Corman snoring gently into a half-finished cup of tea. Outside, the mist had rolled in again, draping the village in soft quiet. "I need to ask you something," Jonathan said. Mrs. Thistleby didn't look up from the lemons she was slicing, but she nodded. "I don't think the chair was always in the corner," he continued. "I think it belonged in the study." This time, she paused. Slowly, she placed the knife down, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked Jonathan directly in the eyes. "Yes," she said simply. Jonathan blinked. "So you knew?" "I've always known. Why didn't you say anything?" Her gaze softened. "Because no one ever asks the right question." He waited. "You didn't ask if the chair was haunted," she continued. "You didn't ask if someone died in it, or if it creaks when the moon is full. You asked where it belonged." She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the counter. "That chair," she said, "belonged to my great-grandfather. His name was Ellis Thistleby. He was the innkeeper here long before the wars, before the roads were paved, before clocks ticked in every room." Jonathan leaned in. He was a quiet man, she continued, loved tea, hated mirrors, spoke little, but wrote endlessly. Every night after the fire was lit and the guests had gone to bed, he'd go into the study and write. Did he write anything that survived? She shook her head. No stories, no memoirs, just pages, thousands of them, blank. Jonathan frowned. Blank? He wrote without ink, she said that sometimes the act of writing was more important than the words themselves. He felt the hair on his arms rise. One day, he stopped writing, she said, and never came down for supper. They found him sitting in the chair, still, like he was listening. Listening to what? She looked toward the fireplace. To everything that had ever been said in that room. Jonathan tried to speak, but found he had no words. "We moved the chair out after he passed," she continued. "No one said why. No one had to. It didn't belong in that room anymore. Not without him. So you put it in the corner." She nodded. "And no one ever sat in it again?" "No," she said, "because even if no one knew the story, everyone could feel it." Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle in the space between them. The chair had not been cursed, not feared, it had been left behind. Like a bookmark in a book no one dared open again. Mrs. Thistleby reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small, aged photograph. It showed a man, thin, unsmiling, seated in a chair. That chair. His hands folded over a blank journal. His eyes looking somewhere just past the camera. "That's him," she said. "Ellis." Jonathan stared at the image. He wasn't sure what struck him more, the familiarity of the pose, or the feeling that the man in the photograph was still waiting. Part 16: The ink that wasn't there. Jonathan couldn't sleep. The photograph of Ellis Thistleby rested on the nightstand beside his bed. The old man's stare, calm, distant, yet unmistakably aware, had followed him up the stairs like the echo of a footstep that wasn't his own. By candlelight, Jonathan flipped through his own notebook. Pages and pages of questions, observations, and then something else he hadn't expected. Gaps. Entire lines he remembered writing, now missing. No ink, just faint pressure marks, as though the pen had pressed, moved, recorded, but left nothing behind. The words had vanished. He turned the notebook to the lamp, tilted it. The indentations were real. The movements matched his handwriting. But the ink, the substance of what he had recorded, was gone. Just like Ellis. Just like the blank pages in the study desk. He went down the stairs in slippers and silence. The inn slept. Even the fire had dozed into a pile of dim coals. The chair sat in its corner. It wasn't watching him. It didn't need to. Jonathan crossed the room, past the grandfather clock, which now ticked exactly as it should. He stepped into the study, opened the old ledger once more, and flipped to the back. Still there, still waiting. The chair waits. It remembers voices, not faces. We are only echoes to it when it is finally sat in by the right person. It will stop remembering. He stared at the sentence. What does it mean to be the right person? Someone from the family? Someone who listens? Someone willing to be forgotten? He dipped the old fountain pen into a fresh vial of ink he'd brought from town earlier that week, the last vial at the shop. Dusty and long unsold. He pressed the nib to the page and wrote, "I think I understand now. It doesn't want to be feared. It wants to be returned." The ink stayed. He closed the book gently, blew out the candle, and left the study. As he passed the corner chair, he placed a hand once more on its armrest. "Not yet," he whispered, and as he turned to go, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, just for a moment, in the reflection of the small glass of the grandfather clock. Seated in the chair. Ellis. Not aged, not ghostly, just there, calm, still, listening. Jonathan spun around. Nothing. The chair was empty. But the photograph on his nightstand? In the morning, Ellis would no longer be in it. Part 17. The photograph that forgot. Morning sunlight spilled into Jonathan's room. Soft and drowsy. The inn, as usual, was waking slowly, kettle boiling, floorboards stretching, but Jonathan sat frozen at his nightstand, staring at the photograph. It was the same frame, same yellowed edges, same backdrop, the study wall with its old window and the edge of the desk. But the chair was empty. Ellis was gone. Jonathan hadn't moved it, hadn't touched it, and yet, where once had been the quiet, watchful figure of the inn's former keeper, there was now nothing. Just the chair, slightly indented, lit by a shaft of fading afternoon light caught in stillness. He picked up the frame, turned it over. No damage, no trick, no sleight of hand. The photograph had changed, or perhaps it had remembered something differently. He brought it downstairs, half expecting Mrs. Thistleby to laugh, to tell him it had always looked that way. But when she saw it, her face paled slightly. "He's gone," she said. Jonathan nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Thistleby took the photo from him with both hands. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "I thought he might," she whispered. Jonathan frowned. "What does it mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the frame down beside the fire and stared at the chair. "It's not just memory the chair holds," she finally said. "It's unfinishedness." He waited. Ellis sat in it every night for years, writing words no one could read, filling pages that never showed ink. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he couldn't say it. Jonathan felt something shift inside his chest. "And now?" he asked. She looked back at the photo. Now maybe he finally said it. And the chair, let go. They left the photo on the mantel. That afternoon, Jonathan sat again beside the chair, scribbling in his notebook. The ink remained this time. Solid, sharp, certain. He wrote, "It's not a haunted object. It's a vessel. A resting place for the unsaid. For the long-held silence of a life that didn't want to be forgotten. But didn't want to disturb either." That evening, just before bed, he sat at the edge of the hearth and watched the firelight flicker over the fabric of the corner chair. He whispered, "Thank you." The shadows didn't answer, but the silence felt less heavy. Like something had lifted. A little more room in the air, a little less waiting in the walls. Part 18. The return of the rain. It rained again the next day, a long, steady drizzle that blanketed the village in hush. The kind of rain that made people stay indoors not from fear, but from familiarity. The Grindlewood Inn, as always, welcomed the weather like an old friend. Jonathan sat in the common room, legs crossed, notebook on his lap, tea in reach. He was no longer recording facts. Now he simply observed with a kind of reverent quiet. The chair sat where it had for so many years. No longer demanding attention, but not fading either. It was still. Not the heavy kind of still that weighs down a room, but the kind of stillness that follows a sigh of relief, the kind that comes when something, or someone, has found peace. The villagers didn't speak of it. They never had, really. But now they looked at the chair longer when passing by. Their eyes lingered. A few even offered it the tiniest of nods, the kind given to gravestones or to an old friend whose story had ended well. And Mrs. Thistleby? She hummed again. She hadn't hummed in days. But now the tune returned, light and low and slightly off-key. The kind of song a mother might hum when folding linens or wiping flour from her hands. Jonathan smiled. Even the grandfather clock seemed more at ease, ticking now with the gentle rhythm of a room without tension. Then, around dusk, the inn's door creaked open. A traveler stepped in. Young woman, mud-splashed boots, wide-brimmed hat, a knapsack slung low over one shoulder. She looked around the room with the expression of someone trying to remember if they'd been there before. Or just dreamed it. Room for one? She asked. Mrs. Thistleby welcomed her with warmth and steam and supper. Jonathan observed her quietly. She took her tea near the fire. Sat in the exact spot he used to sit, 2 chairs to the left of the corner. She glanced at the chair once. Then again. She didn't try to sit in it. She didn't need to. She simply acknowledged it, like you might acknowledge a person who has just finished telling you something very important. And the chair seemed to accept that. That night, before bed, Jonathan passed the photograph on the mantel. Still empty. Still unchanged. He reached into his pocket and took out a fresh photograph. One he'd had developed during the trip into the nearby town. It showed the common room, taken from his favorite angle. The hearth, the rug, the edge of the study door, and the chair. Only this time, it was filled with light. Not a person, not a form, just a soft glow, like a lantern left on for someone expected to return, or never needing to. Jonathan tucked the photo into the ledger in the study, right beside the last entry. No note, no name, just, returned. Part 19. The visitor who asked nothing. The following week passed slowly, peacefully. The kind of days that slip by without much notice but leave a pleasant aftertaste. Like a soft melody remembered just before sleep. Jonathan remained at the inn, though he no longer questioned the chair. He simply coexisted with it, treating it not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a presence that had chosen stillness. A final punctuation mark in a sentence that once ran too long. And then, on a Friday evening, someone else arrived. An older man this time. Worn boots, long coat, hair gone white but thick as sheep's wool. He said his name was Bram. Just Bram. He entered the inn with a slow nod, removed his hat, and looked around not like a stranger, but like someone who had left something long ago and wasn't sure if he wanted it back. Mrs. Thistleby greeted him with her usual warmth, though even she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place a face that didn't belong to any living memory. Long road? She asked. Bram nodded. From south of the marsh. Been walking a while. She handed him a cup of tea without asking what he wanted. He didn't thank her, but not out of rudeness, more like someone too tired for formality. He sat near the fire. Not in the corner. He looked at the chair. Just once. And smiled. It wasn't a pleased smile. Nor one of amusement. It was the kind of smile that happens when a decision makes itself. Jonathan, of course, watched. Quietly. Patiently. Bram didn't speak to him. But their eyes met once. And in that glance, Jonathan felt something pass. A kind of recognition not of each other, but of the moment. After a long while, Bram reached into his coat and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside was a letter. He didn't open it, just stared at it for a time. Then, gently, he placed it on the small table beside the corner chair. And left. Didn't drink his tea. Didn't ask for a room. Didn't offer goodbye. The inn door creaked closed behind him. And no one followed. Later that evening, when Mrs. Thistleby cleared the table, she didn't touch the letter. She just looked at it, then looked at Jonathan, and said softly, "Let it be." He nodded. The chair remained unoccupied. But now, it had something again beside it. Not a presence, not a memory, a message. And perhaps, that was enough. Part 20. The letter that wasn't meant to be read. The letter sat beside the corner chair for 3 days. No one touched it. No one asked. Even the breeze from the open window seemed to avoid disturbing it. As though it knew better. Jonathan watched it like one watches the final ember in a long burning fire. Not because he expected it to flare, but because it deserved to be seen. It was sealed with twine. Not wax, not tape, just a humble piece of fraying string, tied in a perfect square knot. The paper was thick, old, folded neatly as if by habit. It bore no name, no address, no date. Mrs. Thistleby passed by it many times but never paused longer than a breath. On the third evening, just after sunset, the power flickered. A storm in the hills had begun to rumble, distant and soft like someone whispering into the clouds. The guests had gone to bed. Corman had fallen asleep mid-sentence with a newspaper drooping off one knee. Jonathan sat in the common room with only a candle and the company of his notebook. And the chair. And the letter. Finally, he rose. Not out of impulse. Not even out of curiosity. But something gentler. A sense of completion. Perhaps. He approached the letter. He did not open it. He simply lifted it, held it gently, and carried it into the study, into the room where the desk still stood. Waiting, where dust had settled again in soft patterns like the brushstrokes of forgotten thoughts. He set the letter on the desk, aligned it carefully, then closed the panel to the study. Not tightly, but enough to let it rest. The chair remained in the corner of the common room. Still, that night, as Jonathan went to bed, he stopped once more by the grandfather clock. It ticked evenly, the hands right where they ought to be. He turned toward the chair. And for the first time in weeks, he felt no pull, no breath, no memory, no echo asking for answers. Only peace. The kind of peace that comes when a thing has returned to stillness, not from exhaustion, but from understanding. And somewhere, very quietly, something within the walls of the inn, something old and patient, let go of its long-held breath. Part 21. The first time someone sat down. It happened not with ceremony, but by accident. A week had passed since the letter had been moved into the study. The air in the Grindlewood Inn had changed, lighter. Somehow, like a song hummed softly under breath, had finally reached its last note. Jonathan had continued his habit of sitting near the fire each evening, writing more for himself than for the notebook now. Most of what he recorded were quiet things, the sound of teacups being stacked, the way the rain pooled on the windowsill, the exact hour the hearth sighed and dimmed. It was late afternoon when the girl arrived. Not a traveler, not a local either. She was young, maybe 14, carried a wicker basket under one arm and a rain-spotted coat draped over her shoulders. She had that quiet, observant look that some children carry, the kind that makes you think they hear things adults never will. Mrs. Thistleby greeted her with warm bread and a cloth to dry her shoes. "She's the niece of the grocer," she explained, "sent over to deliver preserves. First time she's been this far out." The girl wandered while waiting. She trailed her fingers along the books on the shelf, peeked through the window toward the garden, and then, without fanfare, walked over to the corner chair. Jonathan watched, instinctively holding his breath. She didn't hesitate, she didn't look around, she simply sat down. The cushion gave a soft sigh, that familiar sound, like the chair had briefly remembered being useful. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again and smiled, not at anyone in particular, just to herself. And then, she pulled out a small book from her coat pocket. A diary, perhaps, or a journal. She opened it and began to write. Knees pulled up slightly beneath her. The room didn't darken, the fire didn't flicker, the walls didn't whisper. In fact, nothing happened. Nothing but a moment so natural, so deeply ordinary, that Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. She belonged there, not because she was special, not because she was chosen, but because, somehow, the chair had finally stopped waiting. After 20 minutes, she closed her book, stood, and walked over to the bar. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mrs. Thistleby, without asking what she meant, replied, "You're welcome, love." That night, as Jonathan recorded the event in his notebook, he didn't write about mystery or memory or even the strange weight that had defined the past weeks. He wrote one line only. It was just a chair, after all, but one that had waited longer than most for someone who needed to sit still. Part 22. A chair remembered, not feared. From the day the girl sat in it, the corner chair was no longer treated like a relic. Not a curiosity, not a shrine, not even a secret. It became, gently, gradually, a seat again. One evening, Corman sat in it by mistake. He lowered himself with the cautious stiffness of age, only realizing where he was halfway into his descent. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he froze. Then he chuckled. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Not so bad after all." He stayed there the rest of the evening, dozing slightly with a mug of tea balanced precariously in one hand. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat and the room didn't change. Even Mrs. Thistleby gave the chair a glance that night, not of suspicion, but something closer to nostalgia. Like seeing an old friend. Long thought lost. Smile from across a room. Jonathan watched all this with quiet awe. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't grand. But in the slow and patient rhythm of the inn, it was a moment as loud as any thunderclap. The chair had let go. Or perhaps, it had been let go of. That night, Jonathan returned to the study. The air inside no longer carried the weight of memory, at least. Not the kind that draped across your shoulders like a coat you forgot you were wearing. On the desk, the letter was gone. In its place was a folded sheet of paper, fresh, crisp. He opened it carefully, expecting the same delicate, slanted handwriting as before, but it was different. This time, the message was printed in small, neat block letters and it read only, "Thank you." Nothing more, no signature, no date, but Jonathan smiled, because he recognized the handwriting. It was the girl's. She hadn't known the story. Not in full, she hadn't needed to. She had simply sat, and in doing so, she had finished something that had never been her burden to begin with. He placed the note in the back of his own journal, tucked it between pages filled with questions that no longer mattered as much as they once had. Later that week, he packed his bags. Mrs. Thistleby met him at the door. "You'll be missed," she said, handing him one last parcel of spiced tea and a slice of oat cake wrapped in wax paper. "I'll be back," Jonathan replied. "I know." She smiled. "But the chair doesn't need you anymore. Does it?" He shook his head. "No, I don't think it ever did. I think I needed it." She nodded, and with no further farewell, he stepped out into the morning fog. Behind him, the Grindlewood Inn stood exactly as it always had. Warm, old, and still filled with things waiting patiently to be remembered, but no longer begging to be understood. And in the corner, a chair, just a chair, waited for someone else to sit. Not with questions, not with fear, but with comfort. Part 23. Postcards from elsewhere. Jonathan didn't leave the village for long. 2 weeks after departing the Grindlewood Inn, he found himself sending a postcard. Not because he missed the place, though he did, but because something inside him had grown accustomed to the stillness. The quiet hum of that chair-filled room. And it felt wrong not to send word back. The postcard was plain. A sketch of a stone bridge over a stream on the back. He wrote, "Still listening, hope the tea's still warm. J." He addressed it simply, "Mrs. Thistleby, Grindlewood Inn, by the Crooked Pine. Past the 4th stone wall." No postal code, no city, but he knew it would arrive. And it did. Mrs. Thistleby pinned it to the corkboard behind the bar, beside a faded advertisement for apple chutney Tuesdays, and a dog-eared recipe for wartime sponge cake. The regulars noticed, of course. They didn't say much, but every now and then, one would glance at it, then glance at the chair, and nod. Even the chair, it seemed, had grown used to hearing from him. A few days later, a second postcard arrived, though not from Jonathan. This one came from a town no one had heard of, addressed only to the chair. The handwriting was careful, childish. "I liked sitting there. It felt like my grandma's lap when she read me stories. I hope whoever sits next feels safe too." Mrs. Thistleby smiled, folded the card, and slipped it into the ledger in the study, which had become, over time, less a book of mystery and more a quiet journal of those who had understood without needing to explain. Soon, more postcards followed. Some from travelers who'd once stopped for a cup of tea, some from strangers who had only heard rumors. One arrived with no return address and read simply, "I never sat, but I think I was supposed to." Jonathan, when he returned months later, found the inn just as it had always been. But now, the wall near the corner chair held a framed collage of cards, notes, and scribbles, all addressed to a chair that had once been avoided like a shadow and was now cherished like an old humming tune. He sat near the fire, his usual spot. Mrs. Thistleby brought him tea. No words needed. And together, without planning it, they listened to the room. It no longer held its breath, it breathed, soft and steady. And the chair? It creaked once as someone else, a quiet stranger with a travel-worn bag, settled into it for the first time that week. No mystery, no tension, just comfort. Part 24. The ledger grows. The old ledger in the study was no longer dusty. Mrs. Thistleby had taken to polishing the desk once a week. She'd open the panel gently, as though not to wake the air, and light a candle before entering, a small ritual of respect more than necessity. The ledger, once a brittle record of half-remembered presences, now bore fresh pages, each one carefully filled in neat, steady hands. Jonathan had started the new section himself. He didn't call it entries, or testimonies, or logs. At the top of the first clean page, he had written, people who sat and said nothing. Because that's what most of them did. They sat, they didn't explain, they didn't ask, but afterward, they always left something behind, a folded note, a drawing, a pressed flower, a ticket stub from a train that no longer ran. Not things of meaning to the world, but of memory to themselves. Jonathan had become something of a caretaker for these tokens. Not a collector, not a curator, just someone who made sure they had a place to belong. He pressed them between pages with soft fingers. Sometimes he'd write a single sentence beside them, a mood, a sound, a remembered expression on the person's face. One entry read, left a feather, didn't speak, stayed until the candle burned low, looked peaceful when she rose. Another, sat backwards in the chair, laughed, then cried, said nothing. One day, a musician stopped at the inn, young, tired, carrying a violin case with more scratches than varnish. She sat in the chair for hours, not playing, just holding the instrument close. Before she left, she tucked a single broken string beneath the cushion. Jonathan added it to the ledger with the note, maybe music doesn't always need sound. And so, the chair had gone from being feared to being remembered, from remembered to respected, and from respected to loved. Not as furniture, but as a listener, as a witness to things unsaid. The ledger grew slowly, carefully, but each new page was a whisper, proof that stories didn't need to be told aloud to be real. And late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jonathan added one final entry for the day. He didn't write his name, he didn't describe himself. He just wrote, I never needed answers, only a place to be quiet. And beneath it, for the first time in the book, he drew something, a simple sketch of a chair. Not haunted, not magic, just waiting. Part 25. When silence was enough. The inn grew quieter as autumn deepened. Not emptier, just quieter. The kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone present already understands each other, when conversation isn't necessary to feel accompanied. Jonathan remained. He hadn't said how long he would stay, and Mrs. Thistleby hadn't asked. Some evenings he wrote, some he didn't, but he always watched the chair. And the chair, in its own way, watched back, no longer solemn, no longer a shadow in the corner. Now it simply existed, present, patient, padded fabric and polished wood, worn smooth by generations of thoughts and glances and nearly spoken words. One evening, the girl with the diary returned. She had grown, not much in age, but in presence, taller, more confident in how she moved through the room. She wore the same coat, though, and carried a new journal. She didn't look at the chair immediately. She went to the fire first, warmed her hands, nodded to Jonathan, and only then turned. This time, she asked, is it all right if I sit again? Jonathan smiled. I think it's always been all right. We just weren't ready. She nodded and settled in. No sigh from the cushion this time. No creak. It simply welcomed her, like it remembered her shape. She didn't write, didn't speak. She just sat, still, content. And Jonathan, watching from across the room, thought, maybe that was the whole point all along. Not to uncover a secret, not to decode a mystery, but to remember how to be still, how to sit in silence and let the world soften. As the fire dimmed and the shadows stretched long and warm across the wooden floor, the girl eventually stood. Before leaving, she turned to the chair. Thank you, she whispered. And though the chair said nothing, did nothing, Jonathan felt something move through the room. Not wind, not time, something older, kinder. A kind of peace that settles only in places where listening has lasted longer than speech. After she left, Jonathan picked up his notebook once more. He didn't write a story, he didn't document what had happened. He simply wrote, Tonight, silence was enough. Part 26. A chair in the first snow. The first snow came quietly. As it always did in Grindlewood, not with fanfare. Not with storm, but with a hush that settled over rooftops and softened the edges of every sound. Jonathan was the first to notice. He stepped outside early that morning. A mug of tea in one hand and a wool shawl wrapped loosely around his shoulders. The village was blanketed in white, gentle and unbroken, save for the crooked fence post near the stable that always stuck out like a crooked tooth. He breathed it in slowly. The inn creaked slightly behind him, not from wind, but from settling, like an old woman adjusting her knees beneath a warm quilt. Inside, the fire was already crackling. Mrs. Thistleby always rose before the sun on the first snow, as her mother had before her, and her mother's mother before that. Tradition, she'd once said, was how old buildings kept their shape. By mid-morning, the guests had stirred, boots were dried, gloves were redistributed. A single child, likely a grandnephew of Corman's, squealed with delight at the icicles forming on the eaves. And the chair? It was luminous. The morning light from the frost-dusted window angled just right. It hit the chair's curved armrest, bounced off the polished floorboards, and made the fabric glow faintly, like a coal that had decided not to go out entirely. No one sat in it that morning. Not because they feared it, but because it looked, somehow, full, not occupied, just complete. Jonathan wrote only a sentence that day. The chair looks like it remembers winter. And winter remembers it. That evening, something new happened. A traveling painter arrived, wrapped in too many scarves, smelling faintly of turpentine and lavender oil. She asked for a room and a warm drink, then eyed the corner for a long moment. "Do you mind if I sketch it?" she asked. "The chair?" Jonathan replied. She nodded. "It has tone, like it holds more shades than the room allows." He smiled. It would probably be honored. She didn't sit. She didn't speak while she drew. And when she left behind a small, framed charcoal rendering of the chair. It was perfect, not in detail, but in feeling. She had captured not just the shape, but the stillness. Mrs. Thistleby hung it above the hearth. Not to explain the story, not to preserve the mystery, but as a quiet reminder that even the most ordinary things, like chairs, like snow, like silence, could still be worthy of portraits. Part 27. A chair and a candle. On a quiet Thursday evening, when the snow outside had turned to gentle sleet and the inn's windows fogged slightly from the warmth within, a candle was lit on the small table beside the chair. No one knew who lit it. It was a small candle, unscented, simple, in a stubby pewter holder that had likely been on a shelf for years. Yet there it stood, flame gently flickering, casting a soft glow over the armrest and the fabric that had cradled so many quiet moments. Mrs. Thistleby noticed it first. She didn't ask who had placed it. She didn't move to snuff it out. She simply said, "It suits the mood." That night, the chair seemed to exhale, not literally, of course, but the way a room can shift after someone says a kind word. The kind of shift that invites stillness rather than demanding it. Corman sat nearby and muttered, "Never seen that light before. But it feels like it's always been there." Jonathan agreed. He watched the flame for a long time. It didn't flicker as much as one might expect. It was steady, a companion to the fire, but not competing with it. That night, Jonathan pulled out the ledger in the study and added a short note beneath a page left intentionally blank since midsummer. Tonight, the chair was a lighthouse not for lost ships, but for lost thoughts. In the morning, the candle was gone. No wax, no soot, no trace, just the empty pewter holder, cool to the touch. When asked, no one claimed it and no one asked again. Later that week, a guest asked Jonathan, "What's the story with the chair?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He glanced at the fabric, the frame, the quiet dignity it now held. Then he turned back and said, "It listened for a very long time. That's all." The guest nodded, as if that made perfect sense. That evening, someone else left behind something at the base of the chair. A folded note sealed with dried wax and tied with a red thread. Jonathan did not open it. He simply slid it into the ledger, between the page about the candle and the one where he'd drawn the first quiet sketch of the chair. It no longer mattered what the note said. What mattered was that the chair had become a place to leave things behind, not burdens, but echoes, not pain, but presence. Part 28. When the chair was moved. It happened on a Sunday. There had been a leak near the hearth, not a serious one. Just a drip from a loose slate on the roof that found its way into the mortar above the fireplace. Mrs. Thistleby, armed with a ladder and far more confidence than any roof should allow, insisted it be patched before the next freeze, which meant clearing the hearth area. And that meant moving the chair. Jonathan was the one to do it. Carefully, respectfully, like shifting an old friend who dozed off in the wrong spot. He placed it gently near the center of the room, temporarily, of course. And for the first time in decades, perhaps longer, the chair sat where everyone could walk around it. It looked smaller there. Not diminished, just less monumental. Discentered, relieved. Guests noticed. Some paused and tilted their heads. Some commented, "It's strange seeing it there. I never noticed how curved the arms were. Looks lighter in this light." No one sat in it that day. But a boy, barely 10, crouched beside it and placed a wooden marble at the base of one leg. He didn't say why. He just smiled and ran off to the kitchen where his sister was sneaking extra biscuits. That evening, when the leak had been patched and the stone resealed, Jonathan moved the chair back. But not quite all the way. Just a little off from where it had been. Slightly angled toward the window now. Rather than facing the hearth dead on. It didn't feel wrong. It felt chosen. Mrs. Thistleby stood beside him as he stepped back to admire it. "You think it minds?" she asked. Jonathan shook his head. "I think it's glad to have been part of the room again. Not just the corner." She nodded. That night, no one sat in it. But everyone noticed it. Someone even left behind a small pressed leaf, winter gold, on the seat cushion. Folded neatly in a square of parchment. No note, no message, just the leaf. Jonathan added it to the ledger. Carefully taped between 2 pages. And beside it, he wrote, "We always thought it was waiting, but maybe it was resting." Part 29. The sound it made once. It wasn't a creak, not a groan, or a sigh, or the familiar hush of fabric settling beneath weight. No, this sound was different. It happened just after midnight. Long after the inn had gone quiet. When even the embers in the hearth had finished their last orange glow and the only light came from the faint frost moon pressing through the far windows. Jonathan had been awake, not from worry, but from thought. The kind of thoughts that visit only when the world is too quiet to ignore them. He had risen for water. Bare feet on cool boards. The common room still held the scent of dried herbs and apple skins. He didn't light a lamp. There was no need. And as he passed the chair, now angled slightly toward the window, as it had chosen to remain, he heard it. Not from the chair itself, from the air around it, a single soft note. Not musical, precisely, but musical in spirit. A tone. Brief, clear, kind. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Like a bell struck by memory rather than metal. Like someone saying, "Yes, this is right now." Jonathan froze. He looked down. The chair was empty. But there was something new on the seat cushion. A folded cloth, not left by any guest. Not placed by hand. He picked it up gently. Inside was a single knitting needle. Worn smooth. Wrapped in blue thread. He turned to look for Mrs. Thistleby. But the house was asleep. He thought, perhaps, he'd ask her in the morning. He didn't have to. Because tucked beneath the needle, almost hidden in the cloth, was a tiny scrap of paper. No larger than a coin. On it, in neat, looping script, "For my grandmother. I think she finally heard it too." Jonathan held the cloth to his chest. And for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The sound hadn't come to summon. It had come to close. To seal something, to hum the last bar of a long-held tune, to end not with silence, but with stillness and sound. He placed the cloth gently in the study. Beside the ledger. Not inside it. Not everything belonged on paper. The chair didn't make another sound. It didn't need to. Part 30. And so the chair remained. Winter gave way to spring with little warning. One day the frost still clung to the stones. The next, snowmelt trickled softly from the eaves. And the garden, long left alone for the season, began to stir with shy green shoots. Life moved gently, without announcement. Inside the Grindlewood Inn, very little change. And that was, in its own way, the point. Jonathan stayed through the thaw. He tended to the fire, helped mend the window latch that always rattled in the wind, and folded napkins with a level of care he never would have applied in his old life. When guests came, he welcomed them. When they asked about the chair, he said, "It's just a seat, but a good one." No longer mysterious, no longer sacred, but still somehow more than wood and fabric. And so the days passed. Children occasionally sat in it, especially when the hearth was warm and their boots still wet from puddles. Artists sketched it. Readers leaned into its curve with a book on their knees and forgot the time. Even Corman dozed off in it again, twice. No one wrote about it in town papers, no one interviewed Mrs. Thistleby, there were no plaques. No velvet ropes. No ghost stories. Just a chair that once waited and now, simply welcomed. Jonathan wrote less and less in the ledger. It wasn't necessary anymore. But on the last page, he did leave one final note, undated, unsigned, written in pencil so soft it nearly disappeared into the paper. When something listens long enough, it doesn't need to speak. When something waits long enough, it forgets what it was waiting for, and when something is loved long enough, it becomes part of the room. He closed the ledger gently, blew out the candle in the study, and stepped into the common room one last time that season. The fire crackled. The chair sat at its slight angle, watching the window, not the people. Jonathan smiled. Then he took his coat, nodded to Mrs. Thistleby, and left by the front door without a word. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and blooming violets. Inside, the chair remained, still, quiet, waiting for no one, and for anyone. Part 31. After the story. Years passed. Grindlewood changed in the small ways villages always do. The blacksmith's shed became a tea shop. The old footbridge was replaced by a newer one that looked older. And the road signs were painted again. Twice. By someone with a shaky hand and no ladder. But the inn, the Grindlewood Inn, remained. Not untouched. Just unchanged in the ways that mattered. Mrs. Thistleby retired. Her niece, Clara, took over. Same eyes, same biscuits, new apron. She kept the same kettle, though, said it tasted better with age. Jonathan's name was never carved into any wall, but some said he still sent postcards now and then. A leaf pressed inside, a phrase underlined, a sketch of a chair drawn from memory. Even though he never needed to look. The ledger, by then, had become a fixture. It rested in a glass cabinet in the corner of the study, opened now and then by curious guests. Not every entry made sense. Some were drawings, some were just dates. One page had only a coffee ring and the word, peaceful. And the chair? Still there. Still near the window. Still the comfiest. Some guests asked why it sat at such an odd angle. Clara always smiled and said, "It prefers the light." No one feared it. They sat, they rested, they read, they listened, sometimes not to the chair, but to what they themselves had brought into the room. And one day, long after the fire had been rebuilt for what felt like the 1000th time, a little boy climbed into the chair and asked aloud to no one in particular, "Why does this chair feel like it knows me?" No one answered. No one needed to. The chair knew. And that was enough. Part 32. Letters to the chair. After Clara took over the Grindlewood Inn, she introduced only one new tradition, a small wooden box placed beside the corner chair. Above it, on a hand-painted sign, "For thoughts you don't need answers to, leave a note. The chair will understand." No one made a fuss. No grand announcements were given. But within a week, the box began to fill. Folded slips of paper, torn pages from pocket notebooks, napkins with pencil markings, scraps of poetry, doodles, half-written sentences, one envelope filled with dried petals and a note that simply read, "I'm sorry I never said it when I could." Jonathan, when he returned the following season, spent an entire afternoon reading the notes, with permission, of course. Most weren't signed. Many weren't even legible in full. But that wasn't the point. These weren't meant to be read by people. They were meant to be left, to be witnessed not by eyes, but by space, by presence, by the quiet understanding of a chair that had long ago stopped asking why. Some favorites from the box. "You wouldn't believe how much I've changed. She used to sit in chairs like this. That's why I chose this inn. I think this is the only place I've ever felt still." There were no rules. One child left a crayon drawing of a blue fox with antlers and labeled it, "Guardian of the Quiet Chair." A traveler from across the sea left a single coin and the word, "Home." And one letter, folded, sealed, and taped shut, was addressed not to the inn, not to the past, not even to someone lost. It said, To the me I was before I got tired. Clara placed it in the study drawer. Beside the ledger. Beside the candle holder. Beside the knitting needle wrapped in blue thread. None of it was explained to guests. Because the chair didn't explain either. It just waited, and when someone sat, it listened, and when they left, it kept what they left behind. Part 33. When the chair wasn't there. It was a Tuesday morning when the chair vanished. Clara had come downstairs early, as usual, to light the fire and begin her quiet ritual of slicing bread, stoking the stove, and opening the windows just enough to let the in breathe. And then she noticed it. The corner was empty. No drag marks on the floor. No note. No visitors in the night, just an unassuming square of rug, indented from years of weight. She blinked, looked again, walked around the room once. The chair that had sat through snow and heat and 100 kinds of silence, was gone. Guests awoke to the news gently, pieced together from hushed glances and careful questions. Did someone move it? Was it taken? Did it leave? That last one was whispered by Corman, now older and slower, but still a man who had learned not to rule anything out. Jonathan, summoned by Clara's letter, arrived 3 days later. He walked into the common room, set his bag down, and said nothing. He didn't ask where it had gone. He simply looked at the empty space, walked over to it, and sat cross-legged on the floor. After a long pause, he murmured, "Maybe it was never meant to stay forever." Clara brought him tea. He didn't touch it. Later that evening, they opened the ledger together. On the first blank page since the girl's note, Jonathan wrote, "The chair listened until it was no longer needed. It did not disappear, it was returned." No one replaced the chair. No one tried. They left the corner empty. People still sat near it, still whispered to it, still left notes in the box. But now they did so beside a quiet space, a space that held absence, but not loss. The inn adjusted. The fire kept crackling, the guests kept coming, and sometimes, when the shadows of evening stretched just right across the rug, you could almost see the outline again. But only if you weren't looking for it. And always, when that happened, someone would say aloud, "It's still listening," and the silence would nod. Part 34. The room that remembered. The chair was gone. Weeks passed, then months, and still, no one moved another piece of furniture into its place. No coat rack, no fern in a painted pot, not even a spare stool to cover the space where the rug was still gently pressed down. That square of air remained untouched. Clara dusted around it, never over it. Guests avoided stepping in it, not by rule, but by instinct, as if the corner had become a shape, not a void. Not an absence, but something solid in its quiet. People asked less and less about the missing chair, but they lingered longer in the room. They spoke more softly near the hearth. They paused, often without realizing it, by the empty space before heading to bed. And sometimes, someone would stand there, hands in pockets, gaze unfocused, and mutter something like, "Funny, I feel like I was just told a story." Jonathan noticed it too. The room had changed, not in appearance, but in presence. It had become attentive, like an old friend who no longer offers advice, but knows exactly when to hand you a cup of tea and say nothing. He took to calling it the listening room in his notes. Not formally, not out loud, just in the margins of his journal. The chair may have left, but the room stayed, and maybe it had been the room all along. One misty morning, a boy left a note in the box by the corner. It read, "I sat on the floor here and felt better after. I don't know why." Clara slipped the note into the ledger. Later, she and Jonathan sat nearby and watched the fire burn low. The light flickered softly over the wooden beams, over the kettle hook, over the woven rug that still bore the gentle ghost of 4 old chair legs. Jonathan said, "It's strange. What is? That something so still could teach a whole room to listen." Clara smiled. Some things don't vanish, they just get quieter. That night, a guest from far away sat on a cushion near the empty corner and read aloud a letter they had never sent. When they finished, they folded it and left it on the floor, right in the middle of the absence. No one touched it. In the morning, it was gone. The room didn't need to keep it. It had already remembered. Part 35. The last entry in the ledger. The day was unusually still, not quiet. The inn always had quiet, but still. In the way the air holds itself before rain, or before music begins. Clara found Jonathan in the study, just after breakfast, staring at the ledger. It lay open on the desk. The same one where the old inkless pages once sat. The same desk Ellis Thistleby had written on without ink. The same desk where memories had settled like dust. Thick but gentle. I think it's full, Jonathan said. Clara leaned over his shoulder. The last page was blank. He held a pen, but didn't move. You don't have to fill it, she said softly. I know, he replied, but I think it wants one more. He placed the pen down and, without looking, wrote carefully across the page. Not every story ends. Some simply sit quietly in a room and wait to be remembered. This is the last page. But the listening continues. He closed the book slowly. And just like that, there was nothing more to write. That evening, as the fire burned low and the mist curled against the window glass, a traveler from somewhere far and vague arrived. They looked tired, but not lost. They looked curious, but not expectant. They noticed the empty corner. They sat near it, not in it, and smiled. That night, no one left a note. No one whispered. No one lit a candle. But in the stillness of that moment, in the warmth of a fire, and the faint creak of the inn's old bones, the room, and everything it held, exhaled, just once, softly, and somewhere, far beneath the rug, beneath the floorboards, beneath the memory of waiting, something settled, not forgotten, just finished. Party Popper. The end.